Welcome to part 2 of writing rock-solid clinical goals, objectives, and benchmarks. This is the second portion of the presentation that I gave in AMTA National Conference in St. Louis, Missouri. My name is Mary Jane Landacre, and I'm the owner of MusicTherapyWorks.com, as well as the staff music therapist at Lake Mary Center Incorporated. And I'm pleased to offer you the second part of this presentation. The third part of the presentation is also right here on the website, which you can access when we finish this one. So before we were talking about the formula and how you can think about desired outcomes, objectives, and benchmarks, and how you can come up with those things and how it works. And so what does this have to do with writing clinical objectives? Well, in my opinion, the first thing that we need to know when we're writing these goals and objectives is what we're trying to do. What is our end goal? Where are we going with this client? Because if we don't have a clear understanding of those things, we can't write meaningful clinical goals and objectives for our client because we don't know where their journey is going to end up. And so we have to understand this process very specifically in order to really be able to help our clients get to where they want to go at the end. And because of that, we need to understand those various elements, such as what is a goal and what is its relation to objectives and what are the relations of objectives to benchmarks. And once we know what each part of it is, we can then start to work on planning, on how we're going to go through the referral process, how we're going to go through the assessment process, and how we're going to write our treatment plans. And so in order to do this, we're going to use an acronym called the SMART acronym. And the very first example of this particular acronym being used was used in 1981, and the reference is there for you if you're interested. If you haven't heard of the SMART technique of writing objectives, it covers very specific elements of objectives that are important to keep in mind and to include in your clinical objectives in order to make these objectives something that is appropriate for your client and for your treatment format. And so we're going to go over those. And we're going to go over them in a slightly different way than the way I was taught. I was taught S-M-A-R-T, and we're going to think about them in just a little different way. I decided that as I was going through all of these things, that really the SMART objectives can be divided into two separate thoughts. And the first one are things that are very specific to each client that you have that comes through your music therapy clinic, your music therapy area, your music therapy services. And the first one of those is the S. And in most cases, the S stands for specific. It's very, very important, and this is one of my pet peeves, so I'm very passionate about it. It's very important that the client goals be measuring only one task per goal, objective, and benchmark. If you ever are writing something where you have two verbs and the word "and" in between those two verbs, really look at that again, because it's very possible that you're not writing a specific goal or objective. We'll talk a little bit more about specificity here in a little bit. Another part of this element which is important to think about is the A. And the A stands for lots of different things depending on who you talk to and what version of things you're looking at. I tend to see most often, and I tend to use most often, attainable or achievable. And this for me is very important to talk about because you want to make sure that you can reach the objectives that you have, that it provides your client with a bit of a challenge, which is not too much of a challenge, but that it's also realistic, which is the next one here down here. So is this something that the client can actually attain? If you want a client to, I mean, this is kind of an absurd example, but if you want a client to be able to dance a 6-step routine, and the client currently has little to no gross motor function in their lower extremities, that's probably an unrealistic goal or objective for the client at the time that you're seeing them at the moment. And that's something that each therapist has to determine for themselves. And then the last thing that is very client specific is the R. And in this case, I have seen relevant and realistic. Is this something that's even important? And I'm just going to say, first of all, that if you use attainable as your A meaning, then your R, realistic, attainable and realistic, in my mind, are very, very similar. So I would tend to be like attainable and relevant or achievable and relevant. Relevance is important. Is it something that's even important? So let's say that your desired outcome is improved gait function, but you have an objective on improved memory cognition or memory function. That's not relevant to the desired outcome. And so focusing in on those things provides you with the different elements that you're going to change for your clients based on each client that comes in. Now the other two here, the M and the T, are things that I find to be very specific to me as a therapist and how I am able to do music therapy. The first one is measurable. M is for measurable. How do you quantify this skill development? And what are the treatment constraints that are present? I have to think about that because the majority of my clients are seen in an hour of music therapy treatment per week. Now they are there with their classroom groups, which means they are there with anywhere from 9 to 11 to 14 peers. And so I have to put my measurable aspects, I have to make those very, very specific because I want to make sure that I can measure data for all of my clients simultaneously. So I have to think about what are those treatment constraints. If I've got 13 clients sitting in front of me for a music therapy session, I'm not going to be able to do duration recording or frequency recording or play check recordings. I'm going to need to do something that I can embed into our therapeutic treatment. So it may be that I am looking at will volunteer for a turn during 2 consecutive therapeutic music experiences. And then in my head, I can think, okay, they volunteered for a turn here and they volunteered for a turn here, and then they skipped one and then they did here and here. And I can say, yes, they did. They volunteered for a term in 2 consecutive therapeutic music experiences. Those consecutive, it happened twice. They did this, for four things, but only 2 consecutive. And that's something that I have to decide as the therapist. Now, if I was seeing each one of my clients individually, that would be wonderful because then I could do all of those things I was taught in school. I could do the duration recording, I could do the frequency tallies, I could do play checks where I'm looking every 5 minutes to see if the desired behavior is present or not present. But because I do the majority of my treatment in group therapy, I cannot write goals and objectives that use those forms of data management because I can't do those things simultaneously with the number of students I see per group. The last one is T, and that's time framed. This is important when you're putting together goals and objectives because you need to know how much time you have for treatment. Approximately 45% of my students are day students, so they come to us for educational programming. It's not at all uncommon for a student to start with us when they are 11 or 12 and to stay with us until they are 22 and they graduate. So for those students, I can pretty much count on a nice long time for treatment. Now the other 55% of our students are residential students who come to us because they have acute psychiatric needs and concurrent developmental disabilities. And their time with us is basically determined by their insurance companies. How much can the insurance company justify spending on 24 hours, 7-day per week active treatment? And so because of that, I have a very small amount of time where I'm going to be able to provide music therapy treatment to 55% of my population. And so because of that, I'm not going to be looking at the lifelong leisure goals. I'm going to be looking at things that are more realistic to do in a 60 to 180 day placement. And that's going to be something that is very much dictated by my circumstances and the way my students come to me. And so those two things, that M and that T, are things that I have to determine and that I have to work with. That has nothing to do with the client who's sitting in front of me. Now I can make lots and lots of recommendation for them having music therapy when they return to their next environment. But honestly, for goals and objectives that I am writing, I can only control that measurable and time-framed aspect and element. And so I suggest that you think of things as an SAR, and then MT, and you'll see that a little bit later. Think of part 3. All right, so let's unpack these a little bit more. So S equals specific, and when I think specific, I think one action that's going to happen. Here is a good example of a one action goal objective for us that comes to us from the music therapy competencies, the AMTA professional competencies. This is a good example. Sight sing melodies of both diatonic and chromatic makeup. So the goal that we're getting to is that people will be able to sight sing melodies. And it won't matter what kind of melody they're presented, they should be able to sight sing melodies. Really, really good goal. Very specific. Easily answered was the client able to sight sing the melody, yes or no? Here's a bad example, which is also from the AMTA professional competencies. Recognize, interpret, and respond appropriately to significant events in music therapy sessions as they occur. In order for me to evaluate this in a music therapy student who comes to me, I need to set up situations where I can clearly see that they are recognizing, interpreting, and responding appropriately to things that happen in the music therapy session. Which honestly is very difficult for me to do. I don't necessarily know in the middle of a session if my intern is recognizing that something significant is happening. If they do show some sort of recognition behavior, how do I know how they're interpreting this? And then I'm looking at their respond appropriately. So in the discussion that we had during the presentation, we decided that in this particular case, the most important skill was whether or not the student was able to respond appropriately to significant events in the music therapy session as they occur. And so in order to take this from a bad example to a good example, we would get rid of the recognize and interpret at the beginning, get rid of that word and, which is a huge, huge, huge red flag. If you see an and in between verbs, double check and make sure you're only doing one thing. We could rewrite this and make it a more specific competence, a more specific goal, if we say, respond appropriately to significant events in music therapy sessions as they occur, and then you could say, through recognizing and interpreting what is going on in the session. And at that point, all I have to do as the evaluator is measure the appropriate response to see if that works. Pet peeve, I'm sorry. The next aspect here, is the A and the R aspect, the relevant, reachable, and attainable, achievable aspects here. I always say start with the R. So I guess instead of saying SARMT, it should be SRAMT, but I didn't write that in the PowerPoint, so sorry. But you want to start with the R because is the objective that you're writing on something that's actually working to the big desired outcome? If it's not, get rid of it. You don't have to work on that in music therapy treatment. And honestly, the people who are paying the bills probably won't pay the bills if you are working on things that do not relate to that desired outcome. If it is something that is relevant to the desired outcome, keep working, keep going through your process. And then the A, the attainable, achievable. Do you think the client's going to be able to reach the criterion, the end criterion, in the time that's available for treatment? And the answer to that is either yes or no. If the answer is yes, this client is going to be able to reach that criterion in the time that I have available for treatment, then you go for it. That becomes your objective and it's no problem. If the answer is no, they're not going to be able to reach 100% accuracy in this particular task in the year that I have to plan. That's when you start to use your present levels of performance and you then up the criterion every 3 months. So that way you have an opportunity to see if improvement is being made. Oftentimes we set our criterion very high, and that's unfortunate because then you have the same objective that goes year after year after year after year on treatment planning that the client can never actually reach. Where if we establish criteria that offered a challenge, but a realistic and attainable challenge, as opposed to an going from 0-letter recognition to full 26-letter recognition, both uppercase and lowercase symbols, that's not going to be extremely realistic for a lot of the clients that I work with. So maybe instead of going from 0 to 100%, maybe going from 0 to 25% is an attainable amount in that year of treatment that we have. It's important to offer a challenge, but not too much of a challenge, because everybody wants to achieve some goals and make some progress. You're going to use, again, that desired outcome, objective, and benchmark thought to structure your criterion, because the desired outcome is the end goal. And if you're starting from 0%, you're probably not going to get to the end goal. Maybe you will, but for the most part, most of the time, we don't get to our end goal within a short period of treatment, unless your desired outcome is something that is definitely designed that way. An objective should always be less than the desired outcome, unless you're getting ready to finish out the desired outcome. And a benchmark should be broken down into smaller steps of that objective in order to make it work. All right, measurable and time framed. We talked about this a bit already, and we're going to talk about it again. How would you or how could you measure progress on this goal? If you are looking at letter recognition, if you are looking at sight singing melodies, it's pretty easy to do that. You can test. That's pretty nice. If you're looking for things that are a little less concrete, that may be more abstract, like executive function control, you may need to get a little bit of creative process there for measuring that progress. And just keep that in mind as you're writing your goals and objectives. When you're doing this particular goal, sight singing melodies of both diatonic and chromatic makeup, I know that my professors realized that I could do this when I went through my repertoire tests at various times during practica. I also got this because I passed my music theory class. If I was doing this for a client, I would set up times where I had diatonic and chromatic makeup, and I would give them new melodies and say, sing these, and I would check off yes or no that they did that. There are lots of different ways that you can measure progress on that goal, and you have to think about it in what you can do. What will take the least amount of therapist attention and time during sessions? If I am constantly having to look at my stopwatch to see, to time duration of something, that's going to take time away from what I'm doing as a therapist. What is the most important bit of data to determine whether or not the client has completed the criterion? And for this comes in for me very specifically in treatment planning, because I want to use my therapeutic music experiences to glean that very, very important bit of data. And so the easiest way for me to do that is to structure a therapeutic music experience where I will get that data, because the client will either complete the therapeutic music experience appropriately, or they will not complete the music therapy experience appropriately. And so that's how I'm going to structure my treatment, is by how am I going to get that data? And then how much time am I going to actually devote to this particular skill? And how will I know when to discontinue the skill process? How will I know when the client has reached his or her goal? And how will I know when the goal that I have written is just unattainable? And how will I know those things? And those are things that are very personal, based on what I am doing with each client who comes to me. So there are lots of ways to simplify your work as a therapist, especially as your caseload increases. I write data statements that can be answered with the words yes or no. Here's an example. Client will complete 3 one-step directives during sequencing experiences with no more than 3 sung prompts during data checking sessions by January 31st, 2018. Present level of performance, client-specific aspect and element, completes one-step directives with 4 or more sung prompts. So I can write a data statement. I can answer this with yes or no. We can get to the end of the session and I can say, did they complete 3 one-step directives during sequencing experiences? Yes or no. With no more than 3 sung prompts? Yes or no. So here's how I'm going to structure this for treatment. I'm going to develop sequencing experiences, things where they have to come up with a sequence and remember that sequence. I am going to embed in that sequencing experience opportunities for 3 sung prompts. And I'm going to put in 3 of those situations. So just an example off the top of my head, just completely making this up as we go along, and I apologize if the guitar, that's not too bad, is as out of tune. For example, we might do a Simon Says game. And like I said, I'm making this up, so forgive me if it doesn't make complete sense. But a Simon Says game, we might sing something like, put your hand on your nose. Put your hand on your nose. Put your hand on your nose. Simon Says, put your hand on your nose. Okay, then I might sing another verse. Simon Says, clap your hands. So now I'm looking and scanning to see if my client has done this with 1 sung prompt. Simon Says, clap your hands. 2nd sung prompt. Simon Says, clap your hands. Simon Says, clap your hands. So now I can sit there and I can scan that particular client and all the other clients and say, were they able to do that? Yes or no? Sorry for that. Thanks for putting up with me. So, did the client complete 3 one-step directives with no more than 3 sung prompts? Yes, Johnny did a really good job. He put his hands on his nose, he clapped his hands when Simon said to do so, and he also stretched up high. And he did each one of those after I repeated the directive 2 times, after I sang the directive 2 times. So yes, he did. Now I can put in more information, but I have the essential data that I need, which is that he's starting to complete one-step directives. Excuse me. If your answer is yes, that is wonderful. That is tremendous. Good job, Johnny. If your answer is no, then how many did they complete within the criterion? Johnny completed one one-step directive with no more than 3 sung prompts. And then the additional 2 directives that were sung, he required 4 sung prompts. So we're showing a little bit of data, or a little bit of gain, but not where we are yet. You need to remember how you're working with your client as you're writing your data elements. And this goes again into that treatment planning aspect. It's again, very difficult to do those things that I was taught in school if you have more than 3 clients in the session. I would say that if you have 3 clients in the session, you could probably do simultaneous duration, frequency, and play checks. But if you have more than 3, you're not going to be able to do that. And you have to remember that when you are writing your goals, objectives, and benchmarks. Okay, I just said that. You want to strengthen the ways that you're collecting data so you can include them within the session structure as you are putting together your session strategy plans. And that is a completely different presentation that I could go on for hours and hours and hours about. In fact, look for that in one of my CMTE courses being offered pretty soon. Shameless plug, sorry. All right, so in the example that I gave you on the last slide, I said during specific testing dates. And you can choose, at least in my facility, I can choose whether or not I'm going to do specific testing dates or whether I'm going to do continual testing. And this is handy because if I am doing specific testing dates, then I only have to take data on a client at a specific time. Which is wonderful because that means that I only have to take data occasionally, but it's a really big drawback in that I can't tell if the therapeutic treatment that I'm providing is letting the client make progress. And so there are benefits and drawbacks to doing specific testing dates. And then there are benefits and drawbacks to doing constant data collection as well. But I want to make sure that I'm writing those data elements into therapeutic music experiences. So that brings us to the end of part 2, and now it's time to head on to part 3. I'll see you there.